If the ledger's silver-slit femur stills you, please subscribe. Let peat sweet air and wolf-spaced crescents lull your dreams. Stay beside this quiet archive tonight. If this hush of history soothes you, please subscribe. Your quiet presence lets these echoes continue. On winter evenings, the archivist, Juliette Dara, drags the ledger toward a brass lamp whose low flame stains the parchment amber, the scent of warm varnish mingling with the damp wool of her shawl. Her fingers trace the indentation left by the nib that inked the 31.4 millimeters, and she keeps a caliper beside her, polished steel clicking softly against the oak desk as she reaffirms the distance for herself. Outside the stone walls, the Loire mists tap the shutters, but inside she listens for whispers from the fibers of the page, as though the parchment might exhale lupine breath. The femur lies nearby in a linen-wrapped tray, its surface cool as river pebbles when she checks the silver seam. Juliette sketches the bone by graphite, shading the smooth curve, then spoons a pinch of peat dust into a glass vial, labeling it with tight script. Each action is methodical, yet the glow on her skin remembers stories her grandmother told about moonlit transformations. She keeps the archive silent out of respect, not fear, certain that a measured calm allows legends to drift in without shattering. The caliper closes with a whispering click like teeth meeting, and she pours tea to steady the tremor that follows. In the storerooms of the Iraq Museum, clay tablets from Uruk, catalogued as IM 11-2078, list a ritual against men who run as wolves, the cuneiform wedges so shallow that conservators measure them at barely 2 millimeters deep, as if the scribe pressed gently to avoid waking whatever the incantation held. When the tablet was unearthed in 1909, the excavators recorded a scatter of wolf phalanges beside fired clay figurines, their surfaces gritty with desert dust that clung to sweaty palms. The text prescribes wolf fat mixed with cedar oil, and recited names of gods at moonrise, suggesting a moment when transformation was managed like irrigation schedules. The smell of cedar survived faintly, absorbed into the porous clay, mixing with the mineral tang of packed earth. Reading the transliteration beneath fluorescent museum lights, one feels the same tug as Juliette's caliper, a precise gesture seeking to bind a shapeless fear. Silence covered these tablets when empires toppled, not from suppression, but because the mud brick storehouses collapsed, preserving the words in darkness until archaeologists brushed them clean. To imagine those ancient priests standing with oil-slicked fingers under a rising moon is to hear measured breath balancing between prayer and the quickening pulse of a hunt. At Hattusa, a 17th century BCE bilingual tablet found in Building E records a Hittite king commissioning a Luhaziu priestess to treat soldiers cursed with wolf souls, and the excavation report notes the whetstone beside the tablet, edges worn to mirror smoothness by knives sharpened for ritual sacrifice. Archaeologist Hugo Winkler described the wind slipping through the collapsed gate, carrying the taste of limestone dust that coated every tool and tongue. The ritual called for the afflicted warrior to grip bronze claws while the priestess chanted in Hurrian, her words interlaced with measured beats from a silver bell, establishing a cadence able to slow the imagined racing heart of the wolf. Instead of suppressing the rite, imperial officials ordered it copied, suggesting a pragmatic hunger for control over fearsome soldiers. Years later, the parchment version vanished when a palace storeroom was sealed in reverence after the king's death, and the text survived only in this clay duplicate. The sand remembers. Instruments hum in muted patience. The hollow waits between footfalls and distant heartbeats tonight. Centuries later in Arcadia, the Lykaion festival on Mount Lykaion unfolded under thin mountain air that smelled of crushed thyme and goat hair, and a 4th century BCE inscription catalogued by modern epigraphers as IG Vive 2505 lists the weight of sacrificial loaves, each one talent set aside to bind men who might become wolves if they tasted human flesh. Philosophers like Plato wrote about guardians transfiguring when ambition gnawed at their souls, turning myth into political warning under the clear flicker of oil lamps in the academy. The ritual ash discovered on the mountain, layered with charred animal bone and faint traces of human collagen, shows how fact and taboo overlapped on the altar's blackened stones. Torchlight would have blurred the faces of athletes waiting to run, the stones slick with night dew, their breath forming vapor beside the ridge. Civic leaders did not ban the festival outright. Instead, they confined it to the mountain summit, as if elevation itself could quarantine legend. Modern archaeologists hauled sieves up the slope, fingers numbed by cold, rediscovering in each sifted grain the same unease that made ancient lawgivers assign weights, measurements, and boundaries to the wolf within civic life. When Rome absorbed Arcadia, writers like Gaius Petronius retold the wolf soldier tale with satirical bite, yet Pliny the Elder catalogued lycanthropy in his Natural History, placing it between treatises on remedies, the parchment smelling of warmed beeswax as scribes smoothed the scroll. In 60 CE, physicians in Pompeii recorded cases of men who believed their flesh bristled nightly, prescribing bloodletting measured in ounces and salt rubs to abrade imagined fur. The Villa of the Mysteries yielded a fresco of a man wearing a wolfskin, pigments still luminous with cinnabar that stings the nose during conservation. Residents heard distant growls through ash-thick air the night Vesuvius erupted, the sound likely dogs, but interpreted as spirits, and their panic hardened into stone impressions now on display. Imperial magistrates avoided public mention of these fears, preferring to couch them in medical language to keep citizens orderly. As modern volcanologists examine the strata, they note the preserved footprints of domesticated wolves near the stables, evidence that myth mingled with animal reality under the pumice blanket, binding the city's final hours to the same question of measured marks in bone. In late 2nd century Bordeaux, physician Marcellus Empiricus compiled De Medicamentis, recommending ointments of lupine ash and vinegar to treat patients convinced they prowled by moonlight, and the surviving manuscript invades the senses with the tang of tannin-rich ink and the brittle crackle of scraped vellum. He described placing patients in rooms draped with wolf pelts to overwhelm them with the coarse texture of fur they feared. The textual margin notes a patient whose wrists bore parallel scars 32 millimeters apart, prompting Marcellus to suspect self-inflicted bites rather than supernatural marks. His clinical tone masks the murmuring prayers heard beyond the infirmary, where families burned juniper to cleanse the air. Christian bishops in the region later discouraged such pagan-sounding remedies, not through violent suppression but by recommending psalms as gentler medicine, allowing the manuscripts to slip quietly into cathedral libraries. Modern medical historians opening those shelves smell trapped incense and mildew, rediscovering how Roman science and folk belief shared the same dimly lit wards. When Augustine of Hippo preached in 425 CE, the basilica filled with torchlight reflecting off polished marble, and he cited rumours of Arcadian lycanthropes only to argue for the constancy of the soul, the incense smoke clinging to his robes as he gestured. His argument preserved the tale even as it spiritualized the transformation, suggesting that the human heart could feel tooth marks of sin without changing flesh. A congregation member from Mauritania left a letter catalogued today as Epistula 102 that questioned whether the wolf reports were demonic illusions. The parchment edges carry the grit of Saharan dust, evidence of its journey. Augustine never forbade the question. Instead, he invited the writer to maintain reverent silence when tales strained comprehension, an awe-filled pause that let the myth breathe without commanding belief. Present-day scholars reading the Latin under LED lamps still hear the echo of chant drifting through the basilica, joining theological syllogism to the old, precise measures of bite and blood. In the Annals of Ulster, an entry for 675 CE notes that Bishop Teretian baptized a family in Ossory whose lineage ran with wolves every 7 years, and the vellum retains a faint scent of bog myrtle pressed into its binding by monks. The story situates the family at a stone circle where rain coursed down lichen, each droplet sounding like distant paws on leaves, and the chronicler recorded that the bishop touched the kin with a reliquary of St. Patrick's arm. Instead of casting them out, the church enclosed the rite within sacrament, acknowledging the clause on their souls by naming them absolved. When Viking raids later threatened the scriptorium, Monks hid the annal beneath a flagstone slick with candle wax, saving text and tale alike through cautious concealment. Preservation came from fearful pragmatism, a silence enforced by survival, not censorship. Mist curls around the record every time it is read aloud in the archive. The moss listens. The bell quiets. The moon waits with patient frost along the sill. Gerald of Wales wrote in 1185 of a priest meeting a talking wolf in Meath, the account preserved in Topographia Hibernica, whose calfskin pages smell faintly of the smoke from the Norman hearth, where it was read aloud to would-be conquerors. He described the wolf's fur as coarse as wet rushes and its breath warm as peat fire, and he claimed the animal peeled its skin back to reveal a devout woman beneath. Norman barons, hearing the tale beneath iron chandeliers, used it to portray Irish lands as enchanted, justifying invasion under the banner of civilizing. Yet Irish listeners nodded thoughtfully, treating the story as proof of ancestral pacts between humans and the wild. The English crown later discouraged repetition of Gerald's narrative, not by burning copies but by favouring other chronicles, letting this account gather dust in monastic chests. When 19th century antiquarian James O'Flaherty reopened the volume, motes danced in sunlight across the Latin lines, and he felt the same prickle Gerald once described, as if fur brushed against parchment once more. The Gulathing law, codified on birch bark around 1220 in western Norway, lists penalties for vaga, men who stalk neighbours under winter aurora, and the bark retains a resinous sweetness that clings to fingertips. The statute sets precise fines in 6 rare increments for naming someone a wolf without proof, revealing how reputation could maul more fiercely than fang. Law speakers recited the clauses beside roaring hearths, the crackle of spruce underscoring each measured sentence. Instead of erasing the idea of shapeshifters, the law domesticated it, drawing it into the same columns that managed grazing rights and ship dues. A later Christian scribe copied the text onto parchment, but a spill of lamp oil smeared the word "vag," leaving a shadow like a paw print. Norwegian historians preserving the bark roll report a faint animal musk, perhaps from sealskin bags, reminding them that maritime traders carried these rules through salt spray. The statute's survival shows a society choosing regulation over denial, a calm voice counting the distance between fear and justice. In 1348, as plague rolled across the Holy Roman Empire, a cleric in Bamberg named Conrad von Megenberg wrote a bestiary describing werewolf, knights who prowled forests with eyes glowing like coals, the parchment illuminated with silver leaf that still glitters beneath modern fibre-optic lenses. He measured their stride as 8 shu in length, borrowing the same units used for cathedral nave plans, suggesting that monstrous gait and sacred architecture shared a vocabulary under candlelight. Conrad smelled smoke and vinegar as he drafted the manuscript, plague remedies bubbling nearby, and he framed werewolves as moral warnings for those who abandoned communal worship. City authorities stored the bestiary in a cedar chest to protect it from infection, yet that very seclusion muted the more nuanced observation that fear of isolation birthed wolf legends across Europe. When archivists reopened the chest centuries later, the trapped cedar aroma flooded the room, a rediscovered fragrance carrying the hush of mid-plague prayers. The measured stride he recorded now echoes against museum glass, each shu, a footstep resisting oblivion. In 1521, near Poligny, the trial of Pierre Garnier and Michel Verdun unfolded in a courthouse smelling of damp limestone, with clerks documenting the accused confessing to donning wolfskins gifted by a shadowy knight. The proceedings list precise doses of salves, bay leaf, wolf fat, powdered glass, stirred counterclockwise by candles' sputter, aiming to replicate the sensation of fur sprouting beneath the skin. Torture marks measured in finger widths marred the defendant's wrists, the notes coldly recording distances as if cataloguing textiles. Bishop Pierre de la Baume sealed the transcripts afterward, claiming such horrors required containment to prevent imitation, a deliberate suppression that stored myth in silence. When the vault cracked 2 centuries later, Scholars tasting dust on the air wondered whether the monstrous confession reflected demonic pacts or the pressures of hunger during failed harvests. How can a measurement of wounds carry both courtroom cruelty and moonlit terror without tearing? The question lingers like iron on the tongue, unresolved even under modern scrutiny. Only decades later, the Dole tailor Gilles Garnier faced execution, and the official Procès contre le loup-garou details how villagers found child bones on a frost-hardened hillside, each tibia notched 31 to 32 millimeters apart, the same spacing Juliet traces with her caliper centuries after. Witnesses describe the smell of roasted chestnuts mingling with the copper scent of blood in Garnier's hut, his wife stirring stew with trembling hands. The court physician sketched scratches across his shoulders, the quill squeaking as the candle guttered, and he noted a sliver of silver embedded in bone where villagers struck him with blessed shot. Authorities hushed the case once sentence fell, not from mercy, but to prevent panic in markets already thin with winter stores. The silence grew heavy, like snow-laden branches pressing downward, until 19th century historians reopened the dossier and the paper exhaled cold air. Ember light flickers. Snow breathes beyond shutters. The measured howl circles and returns, unspent, tracing frost along forgotten doorways. In 1692, the Livonian peasant Theus of Kaltenbrunn stood before a Swedish court in Jurmala, the chamber perfumed with pine resin torches and damp wool cloaks, declaring he was a werewolf who fought witches in hell to protect crops. Court records note his staff carved with wolf heads and coated in soot, a tactile relic he thumped against oak planks as testimony. Rather than confessing diabolical pact, he insisted the good werewolves raced with iron chains rattling like winter sleigh bells to reclaim grain stolen by sorcerers. Judges, bewildered, transcribed every detail, the ink smudging where their palms sweated. They eventually dismissed him with a mild flogging, not wanting to publicize a theology that inverted their authority. Rural neighbors kept the tale alive in hushed admiration, hearing Theus's staff strike the earth whenever thunder rolled. Folklorists rediscovered the transcript in the 19th century, the paper smelling of sea salt from decades stored near the Baltic, and they heard in his words a community's desperate hope to guard harvests measured by handfuls of rye. In 1609, the Basque town of Zugarramurdi endured inquisitorial trials where shepherds confessed, under threat and the sting of hemp ropes, that nocturnal Sabbaths turned them into wolves sprinting through damp cave passages. The cavern today exudes a chill that makes breath plume, and moss slicks the stone so boots squeal softly. Inquisitor Pierre de Lancret catalogued the confessions, aligning the phases of the moon with cattle mutilations, his quill tapping the wooden desk in the candlelit tribunal. He ordered the records sealed to stop what he termed contagion of rumour, suppression born of institutional terror. Villagers afterward whispered prayers at the cave mouth, the scent of thyme smoke mixing with ocean spray from the Bay of Biscay. When local historian Serapio Mujica pried open those files in 1881, he noted each margin cross drawn by frightened clerks, rediscovering how persecution etched wolfish identities onto vulnerable bodies. The cave's dripping echo keeps counting the lost, drop by measured drop. By 1764, the Gévaudan countryside trembled as a creature slew over 100 villagers, and hunters mapped each attack with compass and charcoal, triangulating clearings where morning fog tasted metallic. Survivors spoke of bristled fur darker than wolf pelt, of jaws clamping with 34mm spacing, a detail royal envoys inscribed in ledgers beside the smell of tallow from their candles. Naturalist Buffon examined pelts laid across Versailles parquet floors, fingers brushing coarse guard hairs still gritty with dried mud, and he argued the beast was a large wolf trained by human hands. Court gossip suppressed that theory to avoid scandal, preferring a narrative of heroic huntsmen, yet the measured bite marks returned whenever another corpse cooled on dew-damp grass. Local women embroidered protective symbols inside their shawls, threads scented with lavender crush during anxious evenings. 2 centuries later, forensic zoologists studied exhumed skulls in sterile labs, buzzing with fluorescent lights, rediscovering that the injuries matched a hybrid or armored animal, reviving the same chill that once prickled candlelit watchers on those rugged hills. In French Saint-Domingue, planter journals from 1707 describe enslaved storytellers invoking the loup-garou on humid nights, the air thick with molasses and crushed cane, to explain disappearances of captives escaping through mangrove channels. One ledger counts talismans of braided hair and silver coins buried at doorways, the metal dulling in the salty breeze. Colonial authorities feared these nocturnal gatherings, hearing drums pulse like distant heartbeats, and they forbade night assemblies to smother the legend, suppression tied to maintaining plantation control. Still, the songs carried, perfuming the dark with rum and sweat, giving courage to those who fled under starlight. Abolitionist pamphleteers later rediscovered the accounts, unfolding brittle pages that smelled of mildew and sugar, and they reframed the loup-garou as an emblem of resistance. The legend's bite marks reappeared in freedom narratives, measured not on bodies but in the steps counted between cane rows and coastline, each stride a defiant transformation. In 1810, Viennese physician Johann Christian Heinroth documented a patient who insisted coarse fur sprouted along his spine whenever church bells tolled, and the ward smelled of carbolic wash mingled with candle soot. Heinroth measured the man's pulse before and after each bell, noting the racing heartbeat and the tremor recorded in careful ink lines. He framed the case as lycanthropia, born from spiritual imbalance, balancing scientific observation with Lutheran introspection beneath vaulted ceilings where footsteps echoed. Hospital administrators kept the file restricted to avoid alarming polite society with tales of nobles roaming hospital corridors on all fours. Later psychiatrists reopened the cabinet, the leather folder creaking as if the patient exhaled again, and they recognized psychosomatic patterns shaped by centuries of moonlit narratives. The corridor breeze still tastes faintly of old smoke, reminding readers how fear clings to plaster. Lanterns dim, footsteps slow. The corridor listens for another heartbeat to quicken in time with bells. By 1835 in New Orleans, free woman of color, Marie Laveau conducted vigils in candlelit rooms scented with jasmine and river mud, advising clients who feared loup-garou stalked Bayou St. John. Her ledger lists silver-studded gris-gris bags, each weighed on brass scales that clicked softly, ensuring the components balanced like legal contracts. Parish priests tried to suppress these consultations, citing synod decrees, yet many quietly sent parishioners to Laveau when fear outpaced doctrine. The humidity clung to bare arms as drums beat softly in adjacent courtyards, and the flicker of candles cast wolfish shadows along plaster walls. Oral histories recorded by Works Progress Administration. Writers later captured these nights, the paper carrying the smell of roux cooked in family kitchens where interviews occurred. Rediscovering Laveau's measured approach reveals how community power rested in the ability to weigh remedies and legends with steady hands, granting the frightened a sense of agency larger than the swamp's chorus. In 1846, London printers issued penny dreadfuls like The Werewolf of Paris, the press room filled with the metallic tang of ink rollers and the thrum of iron machines. Typesetters justified columns by counting M's with stained fingertips, translating continental witchcraft trials into serialized thrills for clerks riding fog-damp omnibuses. Moral reformers condemned the stories, stacking pamphlets that smelled of coal smoke to warn parents against nocturnal reading. Yet the ban failed. Newsboys shouted headlines through drizzle, their voices echoing between gas lamps. The fiction drew on transcripts recently unearthed by French antiquarians, showing how rediscovered history fed the Victorian appetite for shivers. Readers turned pages under quilts, candle stubs guttering, imagining claws against their window panes, and those sensations seeped into the era's debates over crime, insanity, and urban anonymity. The measured layout of columns and the precise price of a penny-framed myth as commodity, proof that even industry found profit in moonlit dread. In 1862, Russian folklorist Alexander Afanasyev traveled through Smolensk villages smelling of rye bread and wet birch bark, collecting tales of Volkodlak, hunters who donned wolf belts embroidered with silver thread. He recorded the length of each belt, 2 arshin, and noted the clinking of metal charms sewn inside, their cold weight against calloused palms. Local elders described how the belts were hidden in attics scented with dried apples, the secrecy born of both reverence and fear of imperial officials suspicious of pagan survivals. Afanassiev's notebooks absorbed wood smoke as he listened. Then Tsarist censors suppressed his publications, deeming them superstitious. Manuscripts slept in locked drawers until 1900, when symbolist poets rediscovered them, eyes shining in gaslit salons as they traced the lineage from village hearth to modern verse. The belt's measured lengths echoed Juliet's caliper, each unit an attempt to contain the wolf within a graspable span. In 1896, Parisian criminologist Alphonse Bertillon photographed suspects accused of lycanthropy, inspired murders, arranging them against a grid-marked wall that smelled faintly of glue and whitening powder. He captured their scars with measuring rods held 30 centimeters from skin, letting silver nitrate plates etch every line in monochrome. The subject's eyes reflected the gaslight glare, and in the background one hears the hiss of chemical baths cooling. Bertillon believed cataloguing bodies would dispel legends, yet the stark images, rediscovered later in police archives, radiate the same haunted intensity that kept neighbours whispering coyly about moonlit crimes. Authorities filed the plates away, embarrassed when sensational newspapers requested copies, a bureaucratic suppression aimed at preventing the myth from escaping into print. When digital historians scanned the plates a century later, the smell of old cardboard rose like a ghost, and the measured grids behind each figure became another reminder that precision can frame fear without erasing it. Early 20th century psychologists such as Albert Moll presented case studies on clinical lycanthropy to Berlin audiences, the lecture hall warm with the scent of chalk dust and wool coats steaming after rain. Moll projected lantern slides showing EEG-like diagrams of sleep cycles, attempting to translate nightmares into electrical rhythms. Students scribbled notes with metal nibs scratching, curious whether dreams could be charted like railway timetables. Conservative clergy protested softly, suggesting some matters deserved reverent silence, lest curiosity provoke spiritual peril. Moll archived his diagrams meticulously, yet wars soon scattered his library, and many plates vanished in bombed attics, an accidental silence wrought by firestorms. Surviving charts rediscovered in a municipal depot carry singed edges smelling of smoke and damp plaster, returning the conversation to Juliet's careful caliper lines. Night settles gently. Chalk dust shimmers. The mind waits for shadows to lengthen across neatly ruled paper. The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. In 1917, French soldiers in the Argonne trenches swapped werewolf tales under tarpaulins dripping with rainwater, the mud smelling of rot and cordite. A field chaplain noted in his diary that moonlit patrols left boot prints next to paw marks, perhaps stray dogs, yet the alignment, 35 millimeters between pads, struck men as proof of spectral companions. Commanders discouraged such talk, fearing morale collapse, and they ordered the diaries sealed with wax stamps. Decades later, the leather covers softened with mildew, and historians opening them heard distant artillery echoes in their imagination. The trench earth preserved fragments of wolf-bone amulets carved from artillery shell brass, surfaces cold and slick with verdigris. Rediscovery came through chance when a crate broke in a museum basement, spilling the artifacts into fluorescent glare, reviving questions about how fear and courage commingled in mud. The bite spacing matched Juliet's measurement again, a persistent rhythm beating beneath rifles' rumble. Hollywood soundstages in 1935 brewed new myths, as actors laced rubber wolf masks under hot art lamps that smelled of ozone, filming Werewolf of London. Makeup artist Jack Pierce brushed yak hair onto latex, counting strands to keep symmetry, so that transformation sequences aligned frame by frame. Cameramen timed dissolves with metronomic clicks, turning ancient legends into light projected across velvet theatre curtains. Studio executives trimmed scenes to appease censors who feared panic, suppression motivated by box office prudence rather than theology. Audiences sitting in plush seats heard the projectors whir like a soft growl behind them, and many left theatres tasting popcorn salt mingled with the metallic tang of imagined blood. Film reels stored in tin canisters gathered dust until revival houses rediscovered them, their celluloid smelling of vinegar as decay set in. Restoration technicians spliced frames under cool LED lamps, reawakening the measured dissolve that mimicked the spacing of tooth to throat. During the final months of 1945, Nazi propaganda invoked werewolf guerrillas, broadcasting messages from bunkers reeking of diesel and damp concrete. Leaflets measured instructions for sabotage in minutes and grams of explosives, trying to render terror efficient. Allied intelligence intercepted the transmissions, the static crackling like distant claws across the wireless, and they overprinted the seized leaflets with warnings in bold ink scented of printer solvents. The regime's collapse turned the term into a hushed embarrassment. Former operatives buried armbands in forests, pine needles brushing their cheeks as graves closed. Post-war historians reopened the files, finding underexposed photographs of teenagers in wolf insignia, eyes reflecting flashbulb glare with haunted resolve. The myth was suppressed afterward out of shame, yet its rediscovery shows how statecraft can twist old moonlit tales into measured codes of resistance. The odour of bunker dust lingers on the documents, a stale reminder that fear once moved to the rhythm of radio pulses. In 1951, Canadian psychiatrist Rudolf Langen measured brainwave patterns of a woman convinced she howled involuntarily, using an EEG machine that crackled softly in a room perfumed with antiseptic and wintergreen. He charted peaks at 12 Hz during full moon nights, though the hospital blinds filtered the silver light into pale bars across her blanket. Nurses noted the texture of her skin, gooseflesh rising as she described tasting iron during dreams. The case file, typed on onion skin paper, concluded with a recommendation for art therapy using charcoal to redraw the wolf, a rediscovery of personal narrative as healing tool. Administrators kept the study internal to avoid sensational headlines, a cautious silence born from professional ethics. When his daughter donated the papers to a university, archivists gently unfolded the crisp pages, the carbon copy smudges marking fingertips. The EEG's measured spikes mirror Juliet's caliper in intent, to translate howl into numbers without banishing the echo. The 1967 International Folklore Congress in Bucharest convened under chandeliers smelling faintly of polished brass, scholars debating werewolf motifs while translators whispered through headsets. Romanian ethnographer Sabina Ispas projected slides of Transylvanian shepherd dancers, their leather boots clapping against wooden floors in precise rhythms meant to appease winter spirits. Soviet delegates urged materialist readings, attempting to cage the myth inside economic analysis. Yet local villagers who hosted field trips shared plum brandy and stories of wolves guiding lost children through snow. Conference proceedings were edited heavily before publication, political pressure trimming speculative reflections, a suppression shaped by ideology. Years later, uncensored recordings surfaced in a private reel-to-reel archive, the magnetic tape smelling faintly of ferric oxide as it unwound. Listening today, one hears laughter, clinking glasses, and the steady stepping count that mirrored the measured bite distances of old bones. Mist drifts. Accordions sigh in the cool hall. Notebooks remain open to blank, expectant pages awaiting moonlit notes. In 1978, Spanish dermatologist Antonio Raya studied a family with congenital hypertrichosis on Lanzarote, the clinic smelling of iodine and volcanic dust carried by trade winds. He photographed their faces under softbox lights, counting follicles per square centimetre, seeking to separate genetic condition from the island's whispered tales of hombres lobo. Family members wore wool shawls that rasped gently, and they served Raya coffee thick with sugar as they recited how ancestors hid in lava tubes during Inquisition raids. The doctor published cautiously, aware that tabloids might sensationalize the condition, so he emphasized the dignity of the family and the warmth of their skin under his gloved hands. Decades later, their descendants shared the photos with cultural historians, the glossy prints smelling of stored albums, to remind viewers that human complexity resists easy categorization. The measured follicle counts join bite distances and legal fines as another metric grappling with transformation's enduring allure. In 1993, forensic odontologist Caroline Wilkinson re-examined skulls from Louvier's ossuary, aligning bite marks with articulated wolf jaws using silicone casts that released a sharp chemical scent. She worked beneath halogen lamps, latex gloves snapping softly as she adjusted the mold to 31.4 millimeters, matching Juliet's cherished measurement. Her computer models layered translucent blues over bone, revealing which wounds came from tools rather than teeth, a rediscovery that untangled myth from murder. The ossuary air tasted of chalk, and the silence was reverential, maintained so whispers would not disturb the curved rows of skulls. Municipal officials hesitated to publicize her findings, worried that tourism built on legends might falter, an economic suppression of clarity. Caroline archived her datasets anyway, storing them on magnetic tapes now faintly metallic to the touch, awaiting future scholars who will hear the soft whir of retrieval and the imagined rustle of fur behind them. Tonight, Juliet stands alone in the archive, silver caliper cooled by the breath of winter that slips through the shutters, and she closes it gently over the phantom spacing that has threaded centuries together. The peat-sweet scent of the femur rises as she unwraps the linen, while distant cathedral bells murmur through stone, their resonance mingling with the imagined pad of paws on damp earth. On her desk rest copies of tablets, laws, trials, films, and scans, each one a measured attempt to illuminate the shadow cast by a bite whose diameter refuses to settle into mere data. She logs her observations in ink, the color of twilight, then holds her hand above the page, sensing the warmth of stories that once lay hidden out of awe, suppression, accident, reverence, or simple care. The ledger closes with a sigh like fur against wood, leaving the room scented with tea and old paper. Outside, the river carries moonlight across its ripples, and somewhere between the water's hush and the caliper's whisper, the possibility of transformation lingers, neither proven nor dismissed, gently awake in the dark. Before she dims the lamp, a soft knock trembles through the archive door, and Juliet finds a padded envelope chilled by January air. Inside, wrapped in waxed linen scented faintly of pine resin, rests a sliver of reindeer antler etched with compact runes. The accompanying note, penned in lilac ink by Professor Inga Håkansson of Uppsala, explains that the fragment was lifted last autumn from a Sami joik site near Lake Tornatresk. Meltwater had exposed a hearth rimmed with stones blackened by seal oil, and nestled among them lay the antler, marked with a spiral of strokes that translate to Ulfhethan's oath. Juliet cradles it between finger and thumb. The surface feels warm despite the winter draft, as though the pledge still carries the body heat of the singer who carved it. The note describes how reindeer moss perfumed the excavation pit, and how distant snowmobiles hummed like muted drums. A modern vibration answering the measured breaths of Iron Age tundra hunters who wrapped themselves in wolfskins to draw courage across icy plains. Professor Håkansson's letter recounts how the Sami elders requested that only a tracing be removed, but a sudden thaw loosened the antler, gifting scholars this reluctant relic. Under a starlit sky streaked with green aurora, they recorded joik verses describing men who followed the wolf sky to shield their herds from raiders. The attending ethnographers noted that each verse is anchored in counts of 8, matching the pace of snowshoe strides, an embodied mnemonic resisting oblivion. The antler's rune spiral tightens at precisely 31.5 millimeters between parallel strokes, close enough to Juliet's measurement to make her exhale slowly. She copies the sequence into her ledger, adding the scent of resin and the feel of powdery snow to her descriptive margin, letting this polar oath drift beside Iberian tribunals and Gascon hunts. The past stretches northward, lit by aurora that sways like gauze. As she files the tracing, her mind lingers on another recent dispatch, this one from the manuscripts room in Reykjavik, where a vellum scrap catalogued as AM 505 Photo Fragment B surfaced during conservation. Restorers, working amid the leathery perfume of aged calfskin and beeswax balm, discovered lines omitted from the known versions of Vatnsdala saga. The edition depicts Ingimunda the Old, receiving a prophecy that his grandson would wear the mind of a wolf without its hide, a warning delivered in a dream punctuated by the hollow boom of fjord ice cracking. The fragment's margins glitter under raking light with microscopic residues of ground hematite, suggesting the scribe mixed iron-rich pigments as he copied the dream in the late 13th century. Scholars measured the rubricated initials and found minute paw-like flourishes spaced evenly, a decorative rhythm echoing the thud of drums used in winter blots. The fragment had been glued centuries ago into the binding of an unrelated homily, a quiet suppression born of practical recycling, and now the liberated slip scents the reading room with a faint musk of lanolin, as if the tale inhaled after a long sleep. Far from northern coasts, Juliet's newest folio holds a translation of the 1533 supplication of Michalogus of Vilnius, recently rediscovered in the Lithuanian State Historical Archive among tax scrolls that smelled of rye dust. The supplication describes a guild of Vilkalakis, who swore fealty to the Grand Duke by running nightly circuits of the city walls to ensure no Teutonic scouts breached the gates. Michalogus implored the crown to remit a salt levy, so the guild could continue salting wolf pelts used in initiation rites, pelts measured by L-rods still faintly scented of juniper smoke from drying racks. The parchment bears faint crescents burned by tallow drips, and in the margin a clerk noted that the runners' footprints were counted each dawn, their clawed sandals leaving impressions separated by just over 30 millimeters. Another echo of the bite span that threads Juliet's dossier. The petition was quietly declined, its story of protective shapeshifters smothered under economic pragmatism, until contemporary archivists brushed flowery residue from the bristles of the folded plea. Across the Pyrenees, a separate discovery hums gently in Juliet's thoughts. A stack of letters unearthed in the Biblioteca de Catalunya, penned between 1643 and 1647 by Sister Eulalia of Santa Maria de Jonqueras. Cloistered behind cedar-scented screens, she documented visions during vigils for soldiers fighting in the 30 Years' War. Her script, thin as silk, tells of angels cloaked in lupine forms pacing monastery corridors, paws whispering over tile cooled by midnight dew. One letter records a visitor, a widowed potter whose hands smelled of ochre clay. He claimed that Catalan militias marched under a standard bearing a silver wolf that bared human eyes whenever moonlight struck the embroidery. Sister Eulalia affixed lavender sprigs to each page, their petals now brittle but still fragrant, and she advised readers to recite Psalm 59 as wolves guard the camp. Ecclesiastical censors redirected her letters to a hidden drawer, wary of conflating sacred visions with shape-shifting soldiers. The rediscovered packet, pressed beneath hymnals for centuries, now releases lavender breath each time a conservator turns a page, proof that devotion and transformation once shared a quiet corridor. Juliet adds another layer with the recent cataloguing of 1738 court depositions from Maramureth, in which shepherds described the Pricoliti, undead wolves who returned to herd sheep when living shepherds deserted their posts during a harsh winters. The depositions, written on rough paper flecked with straw, recount how the villagers strung bells along valley paths so that the Pricoliti would keep time, guiding lost lambs back to folds. Magistrates weighed each bell, 4 drams apiece, to assess taxes, measuring their tones against tuning forks that sang softly in panelled halls smelling of walnut oil. The Austrian administrators collecting the files eventually dismissed the reports as rustic superstition, shelving the testimonies behind cadastral maps. When 21st century musicologists opened the bundle, the bells still chimed faintly when lifted, their cold bronze surfaces dotted with verdigris. They noted how the recorded rhythms align with local carols sung to honour Saint Blaise, suggesting that the undead herders were folded into liturgical timekeeping, a lullaby of responsibility rather than horror. From another continent comes the Carta de los Lobisones, a chain letter preserved in the Museo Histórico Nacional of Buenos Aires, dated 1828, and creased along fold lines that still smell faintly of mate tea. It circulated among frontier families along the Rio de la Plata, warning that the seventh son in a lineage might become a lobizon unless the president served as godfather. Each letter instructed recipients to mark newborn cradles with silver coins cooled in rainwater, specifying coin weights in reals to ensure balance, and to burn Palo Santo wood whose sweet smoke would lull the child. Government officials initially confiscated the chain letters, fearing unrest during civil wars, yet a few survived inside prayer books tucked beneath saddle blankets. Modern historians measure the ink flow with spectrometry and find soot from grassland fires embedded in the strokes, meaning the writers composed by campfire light while the scent of leather tack and damp soil crept around them. The tradition grew into law by 1907 when presidents began adopting seventh sons, proof that statecraft and lullabies intertwined to calm a nation's fear of moonlit suns. Juliet's pen moves gently as she notes the 1872 ethnographic diary of Lakota interpreter Fanny Kelly, stored in the Smithsonian and smelling of cotton cloth and mineral oil. Kelly recorded winter stories shared during a storm on the plains when snow hissed against teepee walls. Elders spoke of Yung Manitou Tianka Wihasa, the wolfmen who guarded the sacred Black Hills by dreaming themselves into the bodies of the pack. They described how the guardians wore necklaces threaded with carved wolf phalanges soaked in sage tea, the scent sharp and purifying. US agents later discouraged such stories, stamping them out during forced assimilation programs. Yet Kelly's diary, hidden inside a trunk lined with cedar bark, kept their cadence alive. Contemporary Lakota linguists restoring the text to digital format remark on the gentle repetition in the storytelling, a rhythm matching the steady beat of ceremonial drums, each note like the measured placement of paws across mirrored snowfields. From Japan, a slim 1904 field notebook compiled by folklorist Yanagita Kunio adds a dusk-hued whisper. While travelling through the Kii Peninsula, he gathered accounts of the Okuri Okami, the escorting wolf believed to stalk travellers along cedar-scented mountain paths. Villagers taught that if one walked calmly, acknowledging the wolf with a bow at the trailhead and leaving rice cakes on mossy stones, the unseen companion would guide safely past ravines. Yanagita's brushwork captures the mist rising from hot springs, the sulphur scent mixing with crushed camellia petals carried in cloth pouches. Meiji officials promoted rationalist modernization and politely sidelined the legend by replanting forests with less hospitable species. The notebook, folded into his later essays, resurfaced when conservators pried open the sewn binding and found the pages stained with tea and faint paw prints from ink-smeared pages resting atop. Today, hikers retracing his route report hearing twigs snap at intervals measured like a heartbeat, and they leave rice cakes in reverent silence, letting tradition pad softly behind them. Juliet pauses to sip cooled tea and considers a microfilm spool mailed from the National Library of Israel, containing 1931 letters between Baghdad doctors discussing patients diagnosed with Kalbiet al-Layl, a night wolf affliction blending insomnia and restless wandering. The letters, typed in French and Arabic, mention floor tiles warmed by brass braziers and the aroma of cardamom thick in hospital wards as patients paced barefoot. Physicians logged the length of each nocturnal circuit, exactly 47 steps along the mosaic corridor, and prescribed pomegranate syrups to soothe the imagined claws scratching at their ribs. Colonial authorities monitored the terminology, urging physicians to adopt psychiatric labels instead, yet the correspondence persisted in private, blending clinical observation with ancestral cautionary tales from Mesopotamian nights. When the letters were photographed onto microfilm in the 1960s, the acetate captured fingerprints dusted with cinnamon, and Juliet now hears the faint click of the reel as another measured set of footsteps joins her ledger. From the archives of Chiang Mai University, a 1958 anthropological report whispers of northern Thai Mai Phieng, communities who believed certain widows could slip into wolf bodies to guard rice paddies from marauding boars. The report, typed on fibrous mulberry paper that smells faintly of tamarind, narrates how villagers offered bowls of coconut milk to the guardian at dusk, counting 3 breaths between each chant. A post-colonial district administrator tried to ban the offerings, claiming they encouraged idleness. But villagers continued, folding the practice into Buddhist merit, making ceremonies by ringing small bronze bells whose tones shimmered against humid night air rich with jasmine. The carbon copies slumbered in a bamboo chest until graduate students scanning local histories found them still dappled with candle soot. The measured breaths recorded there add a new cadence to Juliet's compilation, reminding her that the wolf can wear many names while padding softly through irrigated fields. She folds in testimony from 1969 when NASA's Apollo 11 quarantine logs, kept at the Johnson Space Center and perfumed with sterilized plastic, note how astronaut Michael Collins jokingly warned technicians about lunar wolf tracks seen in their dreams during decontamination. Psychologists monitoring the quarantine recorded heart rates and skin conductance as the astronauts recounted the dream wolf prints dotting fine lunar regolith at precise intervals. They chalked the imagery up to cultural archetypes stirred by isolation, filing the notes beneath psychological stress protocols. The logs remained classified for decades, their edges yellowing under fluorescent hum, until declassification let scholars read the slim entry. Juliet imagines the sterile hum of air recyclers and the scent of freeze-dried meals mixing with the remembered musk of earthly wolves, the measured lunar footprints aligning by chance with the same span that haunts bones and stories. Her ledger makes room for 1987 reports from the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where wildlife biologists recorded wolf packs reclaiming silent villages. Among the data sheets, brittle from damp radiation shelters, lies a note about a zone patrol finding a child's school notebook describing Soviet-era cautionary tales of Volky Ludi in pencil smudged by ash. The patrol logged Geiger counts beside paw impressions in snow, the numbers clicking steadily like a metronome of unseen breaths. Officials downplayed folklore in favor of radiological charts, yet the wolves themselves, pelts tinged with iodine-scented rain, made villagers mutter about ancestral shapeshifters guarding abandoned homes. Biologists now wear dosimeters that beep at intervals, every chirp a reminder that measured science and myth can walk shoulder to shoulder through birch groves lit by ghostly moonlight, diffused in radioactive mist. In 2004, Quebec City's Musée de la Civilisation curated Les Loups de l'Hiver, and conservators borrowed a 19th-century Innu drum from Mashtoyash, its rawhide still smelling faintly of smoked fish. Elders recounted the Atchin stories, often translated as cannibal ice giants, but described in this exhibit as wolf spirits who warned hunters of thin ice. Curators mapped the oral narratives onto projected auroral bands across the ceiling, aligning each tale with meteorological data about freeze-thaw cycles. Visitors stepped on resin panels textured like packed snow. Pressure sensors triggered recordings of whispered Innu Aiman words, paced at measured syllabic lengths matching footsteps. The exhibition booklet noted how missionaries once suppressed Atchin stories, yet modern collaborations revived them, merging climatology with memory. Juliet logs the interplay of frost, drum beats, and measured steps, feeling the gallery's cold seep into her writing fingers. She turns to digital echoes with a printout of 1999 Usenet threads, archived by the Library of Congress, where night shift workers exchanged werewolf lore to stay awake at flickering monitors. The transcripts, smelling faintly of toner, show users timing their stories to the rhythm of server pings, each tale punctuated by ASCII moons hung every 31 characters. Moderators compiled FAQ, citing medieval trials alongside psychiatric studies, proof that even early internet corners sought evidence to cradle their unease. Corporate managers eventually shut down the thread to reduce distractions, yet the logs persisted on tape backups, rediscovered by digital humanists mapping folklore migration. Juliet smiles at the thought of soft keyboard clicks accompanying the same cautious wonder once voiced beneath torches and beside hearths, the measured cadence of typed characters, a modern paw print across intangible snow. Most recently, she adds notes from a 2019 forensic study at the University of Glasgow, where doctoral candidate Erin McRae analysed 3D scans of alleged werewolf bite marks from Scottish ballad relics. Working in a lab scented with ethanol wipes and soda flux, McRae overlaid laser data onto virtual wolf jaws, discovering that several wounds matched iron traps rather than teeth. She published with care, acknowledging how ballad singers along the Isle of Skye still hum verses describing Medard Aluada, lovers who return in fog. Local historians initially feared the analysis might thin the magic, but village choirs embraced the findings, singing the ballads slower to savour each verse, letting the science nestle beside melody. The digital files, stored on servers humming softly like distant wind, carry metadata noting the exact distance, 31.37 millimeters, between simulated canines, another reverent whisper in Juliet's growing constellation. Juliet leans back, the chair creaking like old timbers in a ship's hold. Outside, the Loire drags moonlight toward the Atlantic, marked by gentle ripples that glow silver against inky blue. She breathes in the mingled scents of peat dust, lavender, cedar, sage, jasmine, and sterile plastic that cling to her notes, each aroma a thread stitched through centuries of measured awe. Closing her eyes, she imagines the Sumi-Joik, the Lithuanian runners, the Catalan nuns, the Lakota guardians, the Thai widows, the Innu drummers, the astronauts, biologists, programmers, and students, all walking a shared path mapped by careful counts and whispered blessings. She does not seek a confession, a verdict, or a final proof. Instead, she listens to the ledger's hush, hears the caliper's faint kiss against metal, and lets the story breathe like a sleeping wolf whose heartbeat steadies the dark. When she finally closes the ledger, the parchment exhales warm air scented with centuries, and the room settles into a quiet that feels companioned rather than empty, as if transformation still curls nearby, content to keep watch until dawn blushes the shutters.